Picture two people on the same day. Both have just decided to begin. One has started writing, the other has launched a channel, or opened a sketchbook, or picked up an instrument, or written their first few lines of code. The medium doesn't matter. What matters is that on this particular day, nervous, excited, full of possibility, they both started. Both are talented. Both work hard in those early weeks. Both feel the particular electricity of beginning something you genuinely care about. 5 years later, one of them has quietly disappeared. Their channel sits dormant. The sketchbook is at the back of a drawer. They tell people they used to write, used to make things, used to have this project they were working on. They are not unhappy people, but something that mattered to them is gone. The other person is still there, still working. They are not famous, not yet, perhaps not ever in the conventional sense, but something in their work has changed. There is a quality to it that wasn't there before, a depth, a confidence, a singular voice that makes it unmistakably theirs. People who encounter it feel the difference immediately, even if they cannot name it. What happened between these two people? The easy answer is that one had more talent, more luck, more time, more favorable circumstances. But that answer, as Greene would insist, is too convenient, too comfortable. It lets us off the hook from examining what actually separates the people who arrive from the people who disappear. Creative careers rarely fail because of lack of talent. They fail because people misunderstand the path to mastery. In his book, Mastery, Robert Greene spent years studying the lives of history's most extraordinary creative minds: Leonardo da Vinci, Charles Darwin, Mozart, Einstein, and dozens of others, searching for the common thread. What he found was not the story of exceptional gifts, it was the story of exceptional processes, of specific ways of learning, practicing, failing, and returning, of a particular relationship with time that most people are unwilling to maintain. This is Robert Greene Applied, Episode 2, and today we're going to follow that thread, from Greene's framework into the specific landscape of the modern creative economy, into the world of content creators and designers, writers and filmmakers, musicians and developers, animators and artists. A world that is noisier, faster, and more competitive than any Greene could have imagined when he was studying Leonardo. And yet, paradoxically, one in which his insights about mastery have never been more relevant. Let's begin. Section 1. The Myth of Talent. We have a story we tell about creative greatness, and it goes roughly like this. Somewhere out there, certain people are simply born different. They pick up a pen, and something extraordinary comes out. They touch a piano for the first time, and already they can play. Their first painting, their first video, their first song reveals a natural gift that mere practice could never produce. They are touched by something the rest of us were not given. It is a beautiful story. It is also, by almost every measure, false. The psychologist Anders Ericsson spent 3 decades studying expert performance across disciplines: music, chess, sports, medicine, mathematics. What he found, consistently and sometimes uncomfortably, is that natural talent as a fixed, inherited capacity that determines ultimate achievement is largely a myth. What we call talent is almost always the accumulated result of early exposure, good instruction, and, critically, an unusually high number of hours of the right kind of practice. Mozart is perhaps the most famous counterexample people reach for. Surely Mozart was gifted from birth. the child prodigy composing at 5. But when researchers examined Mozart's early works, the ones written in those famous childhood years, they found what you might expect from any child given intensive musical training by an expert father from before they could fully read. Technically proficient, occasionally impressive for the age, but not the work of a transcendent genius. The compositions we now consider immortal, the ones that justify the legend, came after roughly 2 decades of intensive practice. By the time Mozart wrote his greatest concertos, he had been working at music for longer than most people sustain any discipline. In the modern creative economy, the myth of talent has taken a specific and damaging form. It is the belief that if you are truly meant to be a creator, it will feel natural, that the words will flow, the images will come, the ideas will arrive fully formed, and that if the work feels hard, if you struggle, if the early output is bad, if improvement is slow, this is evidence that you were not really meant for this after all. This belief is responsible for the disappearance of more creative careers than any algorithm change, any market shift, or any lack of opportunity. There is a particular kind of damage that early success can do, and it is worth naming carefully. The creator who achieves rapid early recognition can become, without realizing it, a prisoner of their initial approach. They learn what works at a surface level and begin repeating it. They become skilled at meeting the expectations they've already created, rather than developing the deeper capacity that would eventually allow them to exceed them. Early success, in this way, can quietly foreclose the exploration that mastery requires. Charles Darwin is one of Greene's most instructive examples. Darwin was not considered especially gifted as a young man. His father famously told him he cared for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat-catching, and would be a disgrace to himself and his family. Darwin himself described his mind as ordinary. What he possessed, and what he cultivated over decades, was something more durable than brilliance, a quality of patient, systematic observation, a willingness to look at the natural world with sustained, undistracted attention, year after year, until patterns emerged that no one else had seen. His theory of evolution was not a flash of inspiration. It was the culmination of over 20 years of careful accumulation, of specimens, of notes, of evidence gathered and re-examined and connected with extraordinary patience. The greatest competitive advantage in any creative field is not the ability to produce something brilliant immediately. It is the ability to keep going after the brilliance hasn't arrived yet. Section 2. The Apprenticeship Phase. There is a phase in the development of every master that Greene describes with a word that has fallen out of fashion in our era of self-taught expertise and democratized access: apprenticeship. In its traditional form, the apprenticeship was a formal arrangement, a young person placing themselves under the tutelage of a more experienced practitioner, agreeing to observe, assist, and learn before being trusted to create independently. The arrangement required humility from the apprentice and patience from the master, and it produced, over time, a depth of practical understanding that no amount of theoretical study could replicate. We have largely abandoned this model, and in abandoning it, we have created a landscape of creators who know a great deal about the tools of their craft and very little about its deeper grammar. Greene identifies the apprenticeship phase as the foundational stage of mastery, and he argues that it cannot be skipped, only disguised. The modern creator who refuses to spend time in this phase doesn't escape it. They simply remain in it longer without knowing it, producing work that has the surface features of competence without the underlying structure that genuine expertise provides. What apprenticeship actually looks like in a creative career. It does not necessarily mean finding a single mentor, though that can be powerful. It means, more broadly, placing yourself in sustained contact with work that is better than yours and trying to understand why. It means watching how masters structure their work, not to copy it, but to internalize the thinking behind the choices. It means doing more than consuming. It means attempting, failing, examining the failure, and attempting again. The Japanese concept of shu-ha-ri describes this process with unusual precision. Shu, follow the rules completely, learn the form, the structure, the convention, understand why things are done the way they are done before questioning whether they should be. Ha, having internalized the rules, begin to break them consciously. Experiment within the structure you've built. Ri, transcend the rules entirely. The conventions have been so thoroughly absorbed that you no longer need to think about them. They have become the invisible foundation from which your own distinct voice emerges. Most creators today want to skip immediately to Ri. They want originality without structure, voice without vocabulary, creative freedom without the foundation that makes freedom legible. The result is work that feels unmoored, distinctive in aspiration, but thin in execution. Consider the trajectory of almost any YouTuber or writer or filmmaker whose work you admire. Look back at their earliest output. Almost without exception, you will find something that looks like imitation of the creators they were watching, the writers they were reading, the filmmakers they had studied. This is not a weakness. This is the apprenticeship operating correctly. The early imitation is not the destination, it is the scaffolding. The filmmaker Wong Kar-wai spent years working as a screenwriter before directing a single frame. The novelist Kazuo Ishiguro wrote and destroyed several novels before publishing the work that revealed his voice. James Clear, whose book Atomic Habits has sold tens of millions of copies, spent years writing a weekly newsletter to a tiny audience before any conventional measure of success arrived. In each case, the visible output was small. The invisible development was enormous. This is the fundamental misunderstanding most creators have about the apprenticeship phase. They mistake the absence of external recognition for the absence of progress. The two are not the same. Some of the most important development in any creative career happens in precisely the period when nobody is watching. What looks like wasted time from the outside is often the most generative time of a creative life. The work is happening. It is just happening below the surface. Section 3. Deliberate practice. There is an enormous difference between practicing and practicing deliberately, and understanding that difference is, arguably, the most important practical insight in the entire psychology of mastery. Ordinary practice means doing the thing, publishing the video, writing the chapter, completing the design, releasing the track. This is valuable, far more valuable than not doing it. But on its own, it produces a particular kind of improvement, the improvement that comes from basic repetition. You get faster, you get more comfortable. The anxiety of beginning decreases. But without something more intentional layered on top, you reach a plateau. You become competent. You stop becoming excellent. Deliberate practice, as Erickson defined it, is something different. It is practice specifically designed to address weaknesses rather than reinforce strengths. It involves working at the edge of your current ability, not so far beyond it that failure is inevitable, but far enough beyond your comfort zone that real strain is required. It demands focused attention. You cannot practice deliberately while distracted. And critically, it requires feedback, some mechanism by which you can identify the gap between where you are and where you're trying to go, and use that gap to direct your next effort. In the modern content economy, the equivalent of deliberate practice is not uploading more. It is not posting more consistently, though consistency matters. It is the harder discipline of asking, after each piece of work, what specifically is not working here? What is the weakest element? And then targeting that element directly in the next attempt. The creator who uploads 50 videos while doing the same things in each one will improve at a different rate than the creator who uploads 20 videos, each one specifically designed to address a weakness identified in the previous one. Volume matters. Intentional volume matters more. The feedback problem. Deliberate practice requires feedback, and here the modern creative faces a particular challenge. The metrics available, views, likes, subscribers, shares, are real information about audience response, but they are not feedback about craft. A video can perform poorly because the algorithm suppressed it, or because the thumbnail was weak, or because the topic didn't resonate with a particular audience, none of which has anything to do with the quality of the thinking or the writing or the visual composition inside the video. Conversely, a video can perform very well because it is optimized for the current appetite of the platform, while being, at a craft level, shallow or derivative. The creator who learns primarily from metrics learns to serve the platform. The creator who develops a more sophisticated feedback mechanism, who studies their own work critically, seeks responses from people whose judgment they trust, and compares their work to the best examples in their field, learns to develop the craft itself. Leonardo da Vinci kept notebooks, not sketchbooks in the casual sense, comprehensive journals of observation, experimentation, and self-critique. He would draw the same subject dozens of times, from different angles, in different lights, trying to understand it from every possible perspective before he considered it understood. He was not producing for an audience. He was developing through sustained and obsessive deliberate practice a capacity for seeing that eventually had no precedent in the history of art. The modern equivalent is not mysterious. It is the writer who reads their own work aloud and listens for where it loses rhythm. The filmmaker who watches their edit with the sound off to understand if the visual story works on its own. The designer who looks at their work 6 hours after completing it, when the excitement of creation has faded, and asks with fresh eyes, "Is this actually good?" Mastery is not built by working harder. It is built by working with greater and greater honesty about the distance between where you are and where you want to be, and using that distance as a compass. Section 4. Finding your unique voice. There is a question that haunts almost every creative person at some point in their development, usually in the middle years. The years after the excitement of beginning has faded and before any real mastery has arrived. The question is, what is my voice? What makes my work distinctly mine? Why does everything I make feel like it could have been made by someone else? This feeling is not a crisis. It is a symptom of exactly the right phase of development. Every creator, without exception, begins by sounding like the people who influenced them. This is not failure. This is how creative voice is built, through the slow process of absorbing, digesting, and eventually metabolizing the work of others until it becomes unrecognizable as an external influence and simply becomes part of how you think and see. The author, Austin Kleon, described this process with disarming simplicity. You are a mashup of what you let into your life. At first, the mashup is visible. The influences are legible. The seams show. Over time, through enough practice, through enough honest self-examination, through enough experimentation, the seams disappear. The influences don't go away, but they become part of something that is now genuinely yours. Greene traces this in the life of Leonardo da Vinci with particular care. Leonardo began, as all Renaissance painters did, in the workshop of a master, in his case, Andrea del Verrocchio. He spent years learning the conventions of the tradition: perspective, anatomy, composition, the rules of representation that had been refined over centuries. He learned them not as constraints, but as a language, a precise vocabulary that gave him the means to say what he wanted to say. What emerged, eventually, was something for which the tradition had no template. The sfumato technique, the famous blurring of edges that gives his figures their quality of existing within atmosphere rather than against a background, was not taught to him. It was arrived at through years of experimentation. It was the product of a mind that had so completely absorbed the rules of the tradition that it could see, clearly, where the tradition ended and where something new could begin. Influence versus imitation. The difference between influence and imitation is one of the most important distinctions in the creative life, and it is subtler than it first appears. Imitation reproduces the surface. It copies the style, the format, the aesthetic, the approach. It produces work that looks like its sources, but carries no internal necessity, no sense that this particular person had to make this particular thing. Imitation is efficient in the short term. It allows a creator to produce work that feels familiar, that meets existing audience expectations, that fits recognizable categories. But it does not develop. It does not deepen. And audiences, who are often more perceptive than we give them credit for, can sense the difference between work made from genuine creative pressure and work assembled from borrowed parts. Influence operates differently. Influence goes deeper than surface. It absorbs not just the what of another creator's work, but the how and the why. The underlying thinking, the philosophy, the creative problems they were trying to solve. The creator who is influenced by Ingmar Bergman does not make films that look like Bergman films. They make films that carry Bergman's commitment to psychological depth, his willingness to hold silence, his insistence on the interior life of characters. The surface looks nothing like Bergman. The root system is fed by him. This is why Greene argues that the period of deliberate imitation, what he calls the apprenticeship, is not something to be ashamed of or rushed through. It is where the root system develops. Every creator who eventually produces something genuinely original has passed through a period of being, in some sense, a very good copy of someone else. The copy is not the destination, it is the necessary beginning. You cannot find your voice by looking for it. You find it by making things, for long enough and honestly enough that what is distinctly yours becomes impossible to suppress. Section 5. Mastery in the AI Era. We need to talk about the most significant disruption to the creative economy in living memory. Artificial intelligence can now write. It can compose music, generate images, produce video, write code, and draft copy, often at a quality that is, by conventional measures, adequate, sometimes more than adequate. The tools are improving at a pace that experts struggle to predict, and the implications for creative professionals are genuinely uncertain in ways that resist easy reassurance. But here is what Greene's philosophy of mastery reveals, that purely economic analyses of AI tend to miss. The things that AI does best are precisely the things that mastery makes least important. AI is extraordinary at pattern completion. It has ingested vast quantities of human creative output and learned, with remarkable sophistication, to produce new output that matches existing patterns. Given a genre, a style, a format, a prompt, it can produce something that fits, something adequate. Sometimes something impressive in the way that a very good cover version of a famous song is impressive, technically accomplished, immediately recognizable, and somehow fundamentally derivative. What AI cannot do, what, at this stage of its development, it has no mechanism to do, is to have something to say, to be disturbed by something in the world and need to make sense of it through creative work. To develop, over years of sustained practice and honest self-examination, a perspective so particular, a sensibility so specific that the work it produces could not have come from anywhere else. This is what mastery produces. Not speed, not volume, not technical adequacy. A singular perspective developed through the long process Greene describes, through apprenticeship, through deliberate practice, through the patient search for a genuine voice, that carries the irreducible mark of a specific human consciousness trying to understand the world. What becomes more valuable, not less? Judgment, the ability to distinguish between what is good and what merely resembles good, becomes more valuable as the volume of AI-generated content increases. In a world where any prompt can produce 10 adequate essays in 30 seconds, the person who can identify which one is actually worth reading and why holds an advantage that no prompt can replicate. Taste, the cultivated, specific, hard-won sense of aesthetic that develops over years of deep engagement with a field, becomes more valuable as generic adequacy becomes abundant. The editor, the curator, the creative director who knows not just what works, but what is extraordinary. This is a human capacity that AI cannot develop because it has no history of caring. Storytelling, not the assembly of narrative conventions, but the ability to find and articulate genuine human truth, becomes more valuable as the difference between technically constructed narrative and emotionally resonant story becomes starkly visible. Audiences can feel the difference. They always could. Now the contrast is simply starker. Emotional intelligence, the ability to understand what another human being is actually experiencing and to create work that meets them there, is perhaps the most durable creative advantage of all. It is built through lived experience, through careful observation, through the kind of empathetic attention that no system trained on text can replicate, because it is not made of text. It is made of being human. The creative professional who responds to AI by trying to compete with it on its own terms, by producing more, faster, at lower cost, will lose that competition. The creative professional who responds by going deeper into the things AI cannot do, by developing judgment, taste, genuine voice, and emotional intelligence through the long process Greene describes, is not threatened by AI. They are distinguished by it. In a world of artificial adequacy, genuine mastery becomes the rarest and most valuable creative resource. Section 6. The Long Game. There is something our era finds genuinely difficult to hold. The idea that the most important things take a very long time. We live in a culture that has compressed everything. News cycles measure in hours. Attention spans measure in seconds. Creative careers, based on the evidence of the most visible success stories, seem to arc from obscurity to recognition in months. The 30-year-old who built a multi-million subscriber channel, the 25-year-old novelist with a 7-figure debut, the designer whose work went viral overnight and changed everything. These stories are real. They are also profoundly misleading as guides to the actual experience of building a creative life. Behind almost every overnight success is a much longer story, of years of work that nobody saw, of skills developed in obscurity, of failures absorbed and learned from, of a particular kind of stubbornness that refused to interpret invisibility as evidence of worthlessness. Greene studied this in Person After Person in Mastery. Einstein's theory of special relativity, now one of the most celebrated intellectual achievements in human history, was published when he was 26. It looks, from the outside, like a young genius arriving suddenly. What it actually represents is 10 years of sustained, obsessive thinking about a single problem, beginning when Einstein was 16 years old and imagined what it would be like to ride alongside a beam of light. The publication was not the beginning of the work. It was the culmination of a decade of invisible development. What comparison does to creative development? There is nothing more reliably destructive to a creative practice than sustained comparison with other people's visible progress. This is not a new problem, but social media has given it a new ferocity. The creative landscape that a developing artist navigates today is one in which the highlight reels of thousands of peers are constantly and involuntarily available. Every milestone announced, every success celebrated, every achievement rendered in the specific visual language designed to make it look as significant as possible. The result is a pervasive, chronic sense of falling behind, of being in the wrong place in the wrong timeline, of having somehow missed the moment when things were supposed to happen. This sense is almost entirely illusory. Creative timelines do not operate on social media schedules. Excellence does not arrive according to the conventions of platform announcements. What comparison does, specifically, is redirect attention from the process to the outcome. The creator who is watching other people's milestones is not watching their own work. They are not in the slow, absorbing, unglamorous state of genuine development. They are in the anxious, comparative, fundamentally unproductive state of measuring themselves against a version of other people's lives that is both selected and distorted. Greene's prescription for this is not to ignore the world or to pretend that external feedback doesn't matter. It is to develop what he calls a sense of destiny, a deep, settled conviction about the direction of your work that does not require constant external validation to sustain itself. Not arrogance, not certainty about outcomes. A relationship with your own development that is stable enough to survive the periods when nothing seems to be happening. Because in mastery, something is always happening. The progress is often invisible from the outside, and sometimes even from the inside. But the patient accumulation of skill, of understanding, of perspective, this is always occurring in anyone who keeps working with genuine attention. The question is only whether you will still be there when it becomes visible. Mastery is less about becoming famous and more about becoming excellent. And excellence, reliably and without exception, takes longer than we expect and rewards us more deeply than we imagined. The mindful reflection. Let me leave you with something that I think is easy to miss in a conversation about mastery, because it can sound like a conversation about achievement. It isn't, quite. Mastery, in Greene's deepest reading of it, is not primarily about becoming recognized or successful in the conventional sense. It is about the quality of your relationship with the work itself. About the state that emerges, slowly, incompletely, always in process, when you have been at something for long enough that it no longer feels like performance. When the work becomes a form of thinking. When the craft becomes a way of seeing. When what you make is no longer separate from who you are. The greatest creators are rarely the most gifted. History is full of people who were by every early measure more talented than the people who eventually surpassed them, who started faster, impressed more immediately, seemed destined for greatness. And then something happened. The talented people stopped. And the ones who were perhaps a little less brilliant, but a great deal more patient, kept going. Kept going through the years when nobody was watching. Kept going through the periods of plateau when effort seemed to produce nothing. Kept going through the temptation to chase what was working for other people rather than developing what was genuine in themselves. Kept going past the point where most people stop. Not because they were more disciplined, necessarily, but because somewhere in the long process of their development, they had found something in the work itself that made continuing not a burden, but a necessity. That is what Greene is pointing at when he writes about mastery. Not a technique, not a strategy. A kind of relationship with a creative practice that becomes, over time, the most honest and most satisfying thing you do. The process will be slow. It will be unglamorous for long stretches. Progress will be invisible when you most need to see it. The comparison will hurt. The doubt will visit. But if you stay, if you keep working with attention and honesty and a genuine willingness to be better tomorrow than you are today, something is being built. Quietly, continuously, and with a durability that no shortcut has ever produced. Mastery is not a destination reached by talent. It is a relationship built through patience. The greatest thing you can do for your creative life is to stop looking for the moment when you will have arrived and to fall in love, instead, with the work of becoming. Before you go, I want to ask you one question, and I genuinely mean it as an invitation to think, not just to respond. What skill are you quietly mastering today? Not the one you're planning to start, not the one you wish you had, the one you are actually working at right now in whatever unglamorous or incremental or uncertain way the work currently looks. Leave it in the comments. Because the people watching this, the writers and filmmakers and designers and developers and creators of every kind who found their way here, are in various stages of exactly the same long process. And there is something valuable, something genuinely useful about knowing that other people are in it too. If this video gave you a different way of thinking about your creative practice, share it with someone who is in the middle of doubting whether to keep going. They might need it more than they realize. Subscribe for the next episode of Robert Greene Applied, where we'll bring his philosophy to another arena of modern life. Be patient with yourself. The work is working.